Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Blood Relations, The Sorrel Jane's Mysteries by Lonna, Enox, and this is hosted by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue. The intruder pulled the collar of his jacket up over his neck. Fall was the best time for his small job, but he'd forgotten the chill of autumn evenings. Denim, while it blended into the darkness, didn't offer much protection against the damp air. He stuffed his hands back into his jacket pockets, keeping his eyes on the window. Even with the blinds closed, he could detect slight movement inside. He slid back behind the hedge and counted minutes on the luminous watch dial. 3, 4, 5. He parted branches in the hedge until he could once more see. No lights in the front room now. That small gleam must be the hallway. Could be his adventurous prey had plans for the evening. As if on cue, the garage door began its ascent, clanking to a grumpy halt. After the small car backed out, the door slid into place again. The driver paused in the street as if reconsidering the trip. Finally, the car shot forward down the street. He stepped out around the hedge in time to see the left turn signal blinking at the end of the short block. Then he dashed around back. It would be too easy if he knew how long he had. Even a trip to the convenience store, however, should take 15 minutes. At this time last night, his trial stop there had taken 20 minutes. Of course, he had to consider the number of customers. To be safe, he had allotted 12 minutes for tonight's activities. It only took 2 to open the back window and climb into the photography studio. Then he wasted another 2 gaping at the sheer beauty of the framed prints on the walls. Mostly water birds, except for a whimsical grouping of small critters, squirrels, raccoons, field mice, and rabbits. Talented. Very talented. Had he any conscience, he might have retreated then. His low-light beam glanced against a door. A closet. He crept over and turned the knob. Locked. He had it open in a few seconds and peeked inside. Surely he could have chosen a better spot for the safe than tucked into the corner behind an aged file cabinet. Most people kept only what they thought of as valuables in the safe. Money, jewelry, old coins. He would get those if time allowed, but he had more valuable things to nab. Shelves at the top of the closet held photography supplies and magazines in cardboard boxes. A quick peek revealed nothing of interest. He checked the file cabinet next. Folders were arranged neatly, but not in alphabetical order. The first one, obviously the most used, was labeled Invoices. This guy must keep copies of every receipt. The will had its own folder and even contained a duplicate copy in an envelope with a strange name clipped to it. Titles of the house and vehicle, retirement benefits, credit card information, insurance policies, passport. He scooped those and stuffed them into his inner jacket pocket. A clock chimed, and he glanced at his watch. 5 minutes left. Luckily, the safe was merely a reinforced box with a fairly simple lock. He pulled his tools from an outer pocket and made quick work of opening it. Pay dirt. From inside a nondescript plastic envelope, he pulled a birth certificate and adoption papers. He didn't look at the details, just grabbed them per instructions. A quick look through the rest of the safe offered an envelope filled with about $1,000 in cash. Probably trip money. He removed 3 $100 bills. He doubted the guy would notice anything else. At least, not right now. He could use it all, but caution made him leave the rest. Just as he moved to close the lid, he saw a yellowed envelope. Inside was a tiny photo. He held it under the flashlight and studied it carefully. Excitement coursed through him. Perfect. He stuffed it in with the rest. Tempted though he was, he didn't tour the house or snoop through drawers or other closets. Instead, he carefully pushed the safe into its original spot, arranged the folders in the file cabinet, checked the floor of the closet for leaves or grass he might have carried in on his boots, and closed the door. The window opened easier from the inside. He wished he could latch it, but that was beyond his expertise. Maybe it wouldn't be noticed. People tended to get a little absent-minded with age. He brushed his gloved hand over the area beneath the window, obliterating footprints. Done. He sprinted back toward the hedge and then alongside the fence to the dark alley. The dog across the alley should be indoors, but he'd brought a treat for him, just in case. A dumpster rattled as he sprinted past, and he tensed and skidded to a halt. Peeking out were a pair of big, yellow eyes. Just a cat. He couldn't resist lunging toward it, laughing silently when it jumped past and whizzed down the opposite direction. No more time to play. He closed the door of his rental car with a minute left. As he drove through the intersection, he glanced toward the third house on his right. A car was pulling into the garage. He grinned, adrenaline still pumping through his veins. Tonight called for a drink. Sadly, that would have to wait. He had a plane to catch. Then he grinned. They do sell drinks on the plane. Chapter 1. I could wait in the Jeep no longer, in spite of its cozy warmth. Several dozen people had already gathered in the pre-dawn wonder this Saturday morning, opening day at Bosque del Apache Festival. This was my first visit, and I wanted to experience the morning takeoff. A can't miss according to the brochure. And I certainly didn't plan to watch it from the Jeep. So I zipped my jacket, turned off the motor, and grabbed my camera bag. Most of the dozen or so who had already gathered on the water's edge were older than I. Many held small notebooks in their gloved hands, but a few had electronic tablets. They chatted quietly and nodded as I wove through them until I found an opening on the pond's bank. Birders. I'd met them before when photographing on wildlife refuges. They were usually retired, traveling alone or in groups, most of them keeping a list of the types and numbers of birds they'd seen. Almost always, they were friendly and helpful to newcomers. I saw another photographer farther down, setting up a tripod. I preferred to be more mobile. Photography wasn't completely new for me, but I'd only decided to pursue it professionally when I moved to Saddle Gap. Previously, I'd spent a large part of my life in front of the camera instead of behind it. In my other life, I'd been a television crime reporter, then news anchor in Houston, Texas. That was before my husband's murder, my own near death, and the inheritance that had given me a new life. "Look at the sky," my nearest neighbor exclaimed. The colors in that line of fluffy clouds. I quickly pulled out my camera. The first few orange streaks shot across the still darkened sky, providing a peek at the dark mountains across the water. Thousands of snow geese floated on the shallow pond, busily grooming and splashing in the frigid water. Resisting the urge to snap photos as quickly as possible, I scanned the scene ahead. A distance shot would give me an idea of whether my lens was the right choice. Not for the first time, I wish John were here, all ready to lend advice. "Your first time?" Again, my chatty neighbor. I lowered the camera and smiled. "Yes," I nodded. "It will be quick," she said, pointing at the pond at the geese. "When they decide to leave, it's instantaneous. Over in a minute." Pink, fuchsia, and peach blended with the orange streaks, tinting the cloud bank as I hunkered down to shoot a chatty group of bathers to my left. I could hear the soft murmurs amid camera shutters clicking. The group along the bank had grown to several dozen, but they kept their voices soft so as to not spook the geese. Some snapped shots with their phones. I turned my focus toward a gorgeous pair closest to me. Unlike their neighbors, these two splashed, stretched their wings, and scrubbed vigorously with their beaks. All around, heads pulled out from under wings. Within seconds, the whole pond transformed into a blanket of white, fluffy bodies in various stages of bathing. "Not long now," my neighbor cautioned. I shook off the irritation her chattiness stirred inside me and clicked off a dozen more shots. Finally, I stood. My pocket buzzed. I touched my pocket but left my phone inside. Nothing was too important to interrupt this moment. Whoever it was could leave a message. Fleetingly, I wondered if it was John. I'd expected him to be here when I arrived yesterday. He'd had a longer drive all the way from Branson, Missouri, and I'd only driven a few hours over from Saddle Gap. Still, he'd planned the trip and talked me into joining him. It hadn't been hard to do. John and I had been friends since my college days when he'd befriended a shy freshman and convinced her she could do anything she dreamed. He'd kept in touch after we moved, he to pursue his art and me to pursue my journalism. And when my world fell in, John had flown to Houston and taken me to Branson to heal. A gasp pulled me back. Then all murmurs ceased as everyone stared motionless at the show before us. I couldn't decide who gave the signal, but in unison, thousands of snow geese stilled, gazed up at the now golden pink and lilac sky, and then whoosh! Frantically snapping, I forgot focus and simply aimed. Within seconds, loud honking filled the sky above the emptied pond. The feathered group circled a few times and then headed toward the west in the cornfields the rangers had planted. I lowered my camera. Morning celebration, I murmured. That would be the perfect name for this collection of photos. All around me, people turned toward parked cars, chatting softly. My neighbor had moved closer. I'll bet those are going to be gorgeous photos. I plan to put them in my small shop, I told her, capping the lens and stowing my camera in the bag. I slipped out of my gloves and reached in a side pocket for a card. It's in Saddle Gap, near the Mexican border. If you're ever that way, I'd love for you to stop by. I'm Sorrel, the owner, but it's set up more like a co-op of sorts. We parted at the graveled road. I'd walked toward the Jeep. She joined a group loading into a refuge van. Engines started up, and everyone headed to the next location on the schedule. The next stop was near a shallow pond across the highway from the refuge area where we had been. Apparently, the sandhill cranes preferred this spot for their nightly rest. Every spare inch of the pond held a large gray crane, hunkering down and balancing on one spindly leg. Although the sun had risen over the mountains that formed a ring around the refuge, it was still early. My breath formed puffs in the chilly air, tempting me, almost, to linger in the warm vehicle. But I'd arrived ahead of the caravan of bird watchers, so I hustled to grab a good spot. High above, the squawking snow geese urged their sleepy neighbors to get up. A few cranes had begun to stir, pulling their heads from under wings, shifting long stick legs, and slapping sleep from gray bodies. Others held on to the last moments of sleep before heading off to breakfast with their noisy neighbors. I took a quick moment and scanned the arrivals. Maybe John had missed the alarm, I thought, and would join me here. But I knew I was only fooling myself. John never needed an alarm. He would have been first to arrive at the other pond. In fact, he'd left a message at the bed and breakfast down the road where I'd booked a room for the week. A gasp around me caught my attention. The cranes, urged on by the cacophony of the geese, were taking off. I knelt to capture the pre-flight exercise, wings spread out and flapping, one foot up, beak and long thin neck arched forward, a few moments frozen in this pose. As if they were counting down, each bird suddenly started an awkward trot forward, his neighbors moving out of the way, and then whoosh! With the smoothness of a giant jet, each crane lifted up into the pink-orange sky to the cheering of his raucous neighbors. My chest tightened. If only I could capture a fourth of this majesty. Close to an hour later, I repacked my equipment. Most of my companions had already left for the refuge headquarters where an outdoor country breakfast awaited them. The lure of hot coffee enticed me as well. Only a few cranes still needed to take off. These stragglers had made a couple of half-hearted attempts, but had aborted at the last moment. Giggling, I'd taken some comical photos to add to the gorgeous ones. "Show-offs," a deep voice commented behind me. "Reed." I jumped and almost dropped my bag, but he caught it swiftly. "What are you doing here?" "Happy to see you, too." I tried to pull the bag out of his hand, but he held on and started walking toward my Jeep. "Let's go sample that country breakfast I heard people talking about," he said. "When did you get here? Why are you here?" I repeated, matching my stride to his since he didn't seem inclined to stop. Reed reached the Jeep. He took a deep breath before turning back toward me. "I've driven a long way on a couple of cups of coffee. Bad coffee, and it's sloshing around in my belly. Can't we just get something to throw in with it and talk, like civilized people? I just called to let you know, again, by the way, but you didn't pick up." With the early morning sun in his face, I could see the lines fatigue had made in his face. He set my bag in the back seat and motioned across the road. He pulled off onto a muddy shoulder and parked at an angle, like he'd been in a hurry. But he wasn't looking at me. His eyes drifted toward my shoulder and behind, watching the last birds lift off. "It's John, isn't it?" I asked. No answer. I grabbed his jacket tight in my fists and yelled, "Tell me, it's John, isn't it?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pried my hands loose from his jacket and pulled me into his arms. "It's John," I whispered, my body suddenly racked with shivers. We stood that way for a few moments. I'd missed him. The clean soap smell, the way he threaded his fingers through my hair, the strong heartbeat, his arms strong yet gentle around me. It had been the craziest thing to start out as enemies and end up falling in love. At least that's how it had been for me. But not for Reed. When Terry told me he'd left the police force, I just laughed. It isn't April Fool's Day, I reminded her. Reed wouldn't quit the department. He loves it. What else would he do? He's working with the sheriff's department, she said. Jose is closed-mouthed about it. I couldn't get anything more than that out of him. Jose and Reed had been best friends since high school. In fact, Reed was the godfather for their twin boys. Terry worked for the same newspaper that I provided photographs for and helped run my gift shop. Reed had been totally opposed to our working together in the beginning, when he still thought I might be a murderess. The love stuff surfaced during the mystery and danger that followed. Until he canceled our first official date to leave town that first summer on family matters, that is. I'd only seen him twice since then until now. November, when I was clinging to him once again. I shoved. Hard. He stepped back but kept his hands on my arms. "Let's eat first," he said. "We can leave the Jeep in the lot here. And yes, it's John." "What?" He clammed up. I hated this obstinate, arrogant, sexy man. "I won't eat a bite," I told him. "You always do this. Treat me like some kind of child. If something's happened to John, I have a right to know. I'm not waiting until after breakfast." I pulled my arms out of his grasp, but moved up until our noses were almost touching. "What's going on?" Reed didn't step back. "You can watch me eat then," he sighed. "Sorrel, it's complicated. I've been on the road and I'm exhausted. Please trust me." Had he ever said please? As for the trust part, I'd trusted him with my life before. Trust didn't come easily for me. In fact, the only two men I could remember trusting were Reed and John. "Don't patronize me then," I finally whispered. "I promise." Reed walked over to his truck, opened the door, and waited for me. Patronize is a word that never comes to mind when I look at you.